So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at Hydroplate theory, which of course is about as much a theory as Flat Earth theory or Moon is Cheese theory. Now this is the pet project of Walt Brown of the Center for Scientific Creation. Why haven't you heard of that organization? Well, because it's mostly irrelevant even to creationism, never mind science. Walt Brown's claims to fame include that he came up with possibly the least accepted idea in modern creationism, Hydroplate theory, and that he was on a committee in 1998 to review Arizona schools' science curricula, where he failed to get the committee to drop evolution from the science standards. Hydroplate is the underdog in creationism in a fight against catastrophic plate tectonics, which is the model used by virtually everyone who isn't brown and who has some letters after their name that they think shield them from being known as pseudoscientists, even though they're young Earth creationists, making them pseudoscientists. Anyway, we're not here to listen to Doc Brown. Instead, Brian Nichol has a YouTube channel with literally nothing but videos explaining hydroplate theory. And since video responses and critiques is the basic format for the show, let's take a look. Brian, you're up.
Hello, I'm Brian Nichol, and today I will be covering the basic concepts of Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory.
Hello, Brian. I'm Dapper. I'm here to see just how wrong this is, but it's nice to see from your slide that you seem to actually be affiliated with the Center for Scientific Creation, rather than just being a fan. That means that these videos are probably approved by Doc Brown.
I say basics, which may imply we can cover this quickly. Unfortunately, I found that brevity only leads to misunderstanding, so I'll explain in depth as much as possible to ensure the basics are not simply covered, but that the foundational supporting evidence and science is understood.
That is important, because you're currently engaged in an effort to overturn basically all of science. You're going to need some pretty in-depth knowledge to do that.
First, let's cover the flood passage recorded in the Bible. It is an account which many find hard to believe, and for good reason.
Because nothing about it makes sense if you think about it as literal history for more than about 30 seconds?
Most have not studied the passage closely, and fewer still have established a working explanation which correlates what we see today with what Genesis says occurred.
It's not that few have come up with a working explanation. It's that no one has ever come up with a working explanation, because all of them do not work. The flood is precluded by sedimentology, thermodynamics, nuclear physics, biology, paleontology, radiology, etc. Without essentially infinite miracles to fall back on, there simply is no hope for the flood. But I'm sure you're about to give us your best go at why, no, in fact, the flood is very reasonable and did happen.
The flood seems impossible under the light of casual observation, which leads most to conclude it was not global or is pure myth.
Yep.
We'll briefly discuss the text and context of the flood in Genesis, and we'll then look at Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which I've found to be by far the most scientifically in-depth explanation of what truly was a cataclysm, or in the Greek, katakludzo, which is the very word Peter uses in 2 Peter to describe the Genesis flood as a cosmos or worldwide event.
See, the thing is, though, that I don't care what the Bible says about the flood. It's the reason you believe in the flood, and fine, you can have whatever motive you want for believing what you believe, but the Bible is the source of the claim, not the evidence for it. If the Bible makes a claim according to you, but everything we know about the nature of reality and the history of the world says that the claim is false, then it's false. That's why stories like the flood, the Exodus, and the slaughter of the innocents are all false. They didn't happen because we know more than enough to say that they didn't. At least not as a literalist reading would have them.
The account of the flood in Genesis chapter 6 to 9 brings up some difficult questions. Many struggle to answer these questions without deferring to miracles or concluding that the passage is not to be taken literally. These unsatisfactory answers lead to a certain ambivalence about the importance of this account. Many have concluded that the flood passage is of little value other than a spiritual nugget that following what God says may be a good idea.
I mean, you'd think you could conclude far more about it than that. It's there to show how serious immorality is, and that left unchecked it can destroy the world, which I would say is probably true, and perhaps should be a warning about the morality of pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which affects everyone, including the innocent, and what should be done on a societal level about that, lest a different but also calamitous event take place. You could take life lessons like that from the flood account, or, you could vainly try to establish it as a literal fact and waste your life. Up to you, I guess.
I hope this presentation can help show that the Genesis flood account actually fits modern scientific observation better than the evolution model.
We'll see, but but I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you.
That we've been almost exclusively and sometimes dogmatically taught.
Let's break that down a bit. We've been almost exclusively taught science. I'll presume you mean in science classrooms, and yes, that's what is to be expected. Now, you might say that you're on the cutting edge of science and that you're just about to overturn all we thought we knew, and hey, maybe you are. But until you do, it's not science and it doesn't belong in science classrooms. Kids need to be taught the basics of science as we currently understand them. That is, the parts that are well supported and without going into depth that would confuse them. So that includes the great age of the Earth, universal common ancestry, the even greater age of the universe, the globe shape of the Earth, etc. It absolutely does not include long refuted ideas like a global flood, special creation, or the flat Earth. As for them being taught dogmatically, no, they're taught as science, which is what they are. Science is always open to investigation and change, unlike dogma. But you actually have to do the scientific work to change the consensus.
If the hydroplate theory can show that Genesis gives a very real account of the flood based on scientific principles that matches our observations, then perhaps the rejection of the Bible's historical record should be reconsidered.
Agreed, but that's a pretty big if, my friend.
And if the Bible's history is in fact real, then a re-evaluation of who God is and our accountability to Him should take place as well.
Maybe. That's up to my listeners on their own. I'm not here to tell them what religion to follow or reject.
If correct, the hydroplate theory rewrites our scientific understanding of Earth, and therefore we'll spend most of our time focused on this first question. It is not easy to answer, and I find it requires time both to discuss and to digest. Many times questions have hidden assumptions. Notice this second question assumes that all the fountains of today, including Mount Everest, have always existed.
No, not always, but we know that Mount Everest started forming about 60 million years ago, and we know that because of things like its uplift rate, the rate at which the Indian plate is moving into the Asian plate, the deformation of the rock in the mountain, etc. In fact, that's a pretty short time. Many mountains are much older. If you want to say that Mount Everest is much younger than that, fewer than 5,000 years old, you have your work and your math cut out for you. Unless you bring that math and the work, the only reasonable conclusion is that if the claim is that there was a flood 4,400 years ago or so, that all the things older than that were there before it and persisted through it. I know that's not your claim, but you can see why it's the basic assumption that is reasonable on the part of, anyone who knows anything about mountains, or just reality in general.
Other questions seem to demand a miracle. 40 days and nights of Geshem rain or heavy downpour rain has never been observed. Either this did not happen, was a miracle, or we incorrectly assume that today's hydrodynamic cycle is the source and don't fully understand the real mechanism behind all this rain.
Honestly, of all the problems with the flood, the 40 days of rain is the least of them. Compared to the suggestion that Mount Everest formed during the flood, currently the mountain is 8.8 kilometers high and grows at about 4 millimeters a year. So if we assume that the slow growth has been constant since the flood, since, we don't have any historical or archaeological evidence of it growing rapidly when humans were observing it, it was 17.6 meters shorter, that is, 8,831.3 meters after the flood. According to answers in Genesis, the flood lasted 371 days. So that means that apparently Everest had an average growth rate of 23.8 meters per day. That's almost a meter per hour. Mountains growing at a meter per hour seems like a more extreme problem than just it rained a lot for over a month. In fact, I personally am willing to just spot creationist the rain. I don't need an explanation. I'm not a meteorologist. Take it up with Maddie from Science Side Up. She's working on her meteorology degree.
The next two questions are more readily answered once the assumptions hidden in question number 2 are exposed. We too often assume that what we see today existed during Noah's day.
No, we frequently know for a fact that what we see today is older than the reported time of the flood, both in terms of history, in that history goes back to before the alleged flood, and in terms of physical objects that can't physically have formed as recently as 4,400 years ago. For example, El Capitan mountain in Texas is basically a mountain made of reef materials such as calcareous sponges and encrusting algae. There's a maximum growth rate and deposition rate for such formations, and just this mountain would take longer to form than the alleged age of the Earth according to creationists. Similarly, there are older living organisms, such as some bristlecone pines and quaking aspen stands, that are currently alive and have been since before the alleged flood. The most famous bristlecone pine, Methuselah, was already in its 5th century of life when the flood was supposed to happen, and it's still around now. And you can pretend that dendrochronology isn't reliable, but when it errs, it tends to err on the side of underestimating age, not overestimating age, so that just makes things worse. That's the thing. Just plainly observable reality means that just the basic there was a global flood idea is precluded. Never mind all the crazy stuff we're about to get into.
Because most fail to identify assumptions, It becomes attractive to reinterpret the most natural reading of Genesis into something less than what it claims, thereby making it more believable to our minds.
And, something physically possible. But I guess since we're okay with invoking actual miracles, we don't need things to be physically possible. But at that point, you can't really use the flood as evidence for your ideas. See, the thing is, it's fine to invoke miracles if you want, and I can't tell you there wasn't a miracle, as I can't test that. But if you want people to believe you, you need to actually give them reasons that they can somehow assess. For example, if you had airtight arguments outside of the miracles that show that the early chapters of Genesis were of logical necessity reliable, then the miracle option becomes very easy to believe. But good luck with that. As it stands, miracles are always less likely than natural phenomena as an explanation simply because we see natural phenomena many times a day, but we don't see many miracles, if any at all. This means that the default answer to the question, should a miracle be used to explain this, is no. And in science, the answer is always no, because science doesn't bother itself with unique, untestable events. So even if there had been a miracle-laden flood that left no evidence whatsoever and gave every appearance of being impossible as recorded if taken literally, the scientific position should be to ignore it and continue as if it never happened, because evidently it did not, and that's what matters in science. The evidence.
It is certainly much easier to reword a Bible passage than to rethink everything you have come to assume is correct.
What? No, it's not. How do I even go about doing that? I would have to, become in charge of, the Masoretic text, the Septuagint, the Peshitta, and the Samaritan Torah. How on earth would I do that? Why would I do that? There isn't a king of Genesis, or even of each of the four main ancient textual traditions. I guess I could reword a translation if I were on the translation committee, but even then I'd have to be some kind of dictator over the committee. Normally it's atheists who badly misunderstand how the text of the Bible works. Glad to see Christians too often have no idea what's going on with it. Maybe you should have just said reinterpret, since that would make sense.
So does the local flood idea really fit the context?
I don't care. Interpret it however you want. I'm going to skip until you finish giving your reasons it does not, since this video is titled Hydroplate Theory Overview Part 1, and there's no reason to have such a series unless your answer is no.
Sometimes it is difficult to see alternative possibilities when we have been told what to think instead of how to think critically.
You mean like when you've been told that a young Earth and a global flood must be true no matter what the evidence says? Let's just read from the submission guidelines at the Answers Research Journal, shall we? Quote, papers can be in any relevant field of science, theology, history, or social science, but they must be from a young Earth and young universe perspective, end quote. You know what that is? It's conclusion first, evidence second thinking. That's the opposite of critical thinking and the opposite of science. That's the kind of thing that gets you kicked out of academia, because it leads directly to lying about the evidence, which is something young Earth creationists do routinely, as I've documented on this channel for years now. So let's not get all high and mighty about how the creationists are the iconoclastic rebels like the modern-day heliocentrists fighting the dumb geocentrists. What the heliocentrists had on their side was better predictions, simpler math, and better observations. What the creationists have on their side is what the geocentrists had. A dogmatic assertion that traditional beliefs were better simply on the grounds that they're traditional. Creationists, you're not the rebellion fighting the evil galactic empire. You're the imperial remnant that's been cordoned off by the New Republic in Legends.
Let's begin to answer the fifth question. Where did the floodwaters go? Realize our oceans today cover 70% of Earth's surface, and the average basin depth is 12,000 feet. So the volume of water we have right now is plenty to cover Earth's surface.
No, it's not. If it were, it would. You can say, well, if the Earth's surface were different, which, okay, fine, sure, but it's not. And if you want to say it was different enough to allow for this, you've got your work cut out for you.
In fact, 10 times more water is on Earth's surface than there is land above sea level.
Wait, what? Then shouldn't the Earth be 90% covered in ocean? What does that even mean? Are we doing some kind of volumetric comparison between the granitic crust of the continental plates and the volume of the water in the oceans? What is even being said right now?
In fact, if the mountains and continents of Earth were bulldozed so Earth was flat, the volume of water in today's oceans would cover the entire Earth to a depth of approximately 9,000 feet.
And if the moon were made of blue cheese, it would have 3,908,000,000 calories. Guess what? There's just as much reason to suspect that the moon is made of blue cheese as there is to suspect that the Earth was ever a smooth billiard ball. In fact, it's actually already much smoother than a billiard ball, so this would be a pretty extraordinary level of smoothness on a global scale.
So while huge post-flood chains like the Andes, Rockies, Alps, and Himalayas did not exist,
That's going to be a big ol' citation needed, my dude. The Andes are about 25 million years old, the Rockies are about 285 million years old, the Alps are about 65 million years old, and the Himalayas are about 45 million years old. that it would be convenient for you for these mountain ranges to be less than 5,000 years old isn't a reason to think that they are that young. And if you're going to just start with the assumption that that's the reasonable age estimate for all of them, even though they are actually vastly older and vastly different in age, you're just building this whole tower on a foundation of sand. And I wonder if some book has something to say about building a building on a foundation of sand. Maybe something along the lines of,
"A foolish man built his house on the sand, and the rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it."
I don't know, that sounds pretty good.
Smaller mountains up to 9,000 feet could have existed and have been easily covered during the flood.
And I could have been carried to Jerusalem on the back of a winged horse with a human head. And when you ask me for a description of Jerusalem, I just say, well, it's got a lot of tall buildings, as if that's a good description. Did that happen? I don't know, Brian. You tell me. What do you think? Just making up convenient pre-flood conditions is post hoc thinking. You know you have to get to a flood 4,400 years ago or so you just work backwards to whatever starting conditions you think will work. That's not how science or good thinking works. You need to start with what is evident in nature and then build from there. Do you have evidence that 5,000 years ago all mountains were below 1.5 kilometers in height? Oh, you don't? Because if you did, you'd start with that rather than just saying if at the beginning of all your useless sentences? Right, I thought so. But you know who I'd believe got flown to Jerusalem on a horseman bird monster? My subscribers. So why not take a moment to subscribe with the button right below this video?
So the problem is not that we don't know where the water from the flood went, because we can see it from any beach in the world right now. Understanding this then begins to answer question 4, where did all the water come from? Answering this will take much of our time. Explaining how the water ended up in today's ocean basins will take even more time, so we will have to be patient.
It's Hydroplate. We all know that the answer is the water came from underground, even though that's bonkers. But let's go. Let's see how we get there.
Why do we assume that all the water on the surface now has always been on the surface?
Well, first we don't. There is water that is dragged under the crust at subduction zones, only to be released later by volcanic activity. There are underground rivers and lakes, etc. But those are fairly minor compared to the amount of water which is not under any rock. So why is that? Well, you see, at a basic level, the Earth is kind of like a density tower. In a broad sense, it's arranged roughly from the densest stuff in the middle to the lightest stuff on the outside. So the densest thing that makes up a large portion of Earth's mass is iron, and that's what the core is mostly made up of. The mantle is mostly silicates, which are less dense than iron, and the crust is also mostly silicates, but ones that have cooled. Above them is the even less dense water, and above that are the even less dense gases of the atmosphere. Now, on a human scale, this density tower-like structure doesn't really hold up, as on that scale, local forces can create inversions in this order. So one could be in an air-filled cavern under an underground lake, where there is air, then rock, then water, then rock, then air. Obviously, this isn't arranged by density, and things like volcanic eruptions, weathering of different rocks, etc. can create sedimentary formations over time where density does not decrease as you go up the rock column. But on a global scale, it remains the case that the Earth is more or less arranged by density. The globe cannot persist in some other arrangement, because even the tiniest instability would cause buoyancy to assert dominance and fix it. For example, if between the mantle and the crust were a thick layer of iron and metal, and the Earth had no core, then it would take essentially no time at all for that iron to start falling toward the middle to create that core. Similarly, if there were a worldwide subterranean ocean, then it would be under such tremendous pressure that any shifts in the rock, say from tidal forces, earthquakes, etc., would cause the water to immediately go out onto the surface and the caverns it was in to collapse. Earth simply cannot persist for any significant amount of time with global inversions in density like that. So since the contrary has huge physical problems, the only conclusion that's reasonable is that, by and large, the majority of Earth's liquid water has always been on the surface, minor exceptions notwithstanding.
The problem is when we assume that everything we see now has always been that way.
We don't have to assume that to come to the conclusions that the water on the surface has always been mostly on the surface. We have to assume that physics doesn't change willy-nilly through time. That's it. That's also, one of the basic assumptions of science, that nature is consistent in the rules it obeys through time and across space. Just the basic ideas of science lead to the conclusion that, as long as Earth has had appreciable water, that water has been mostly at or near the surface.
This fallback uniformitarian assumption is ingrained in our education system, but it is not always a correct assumption.
Good thing I didn't make it then, isn't it?
I'd encourage you to research the life work of Harlan Bretz for a small-scale example of what happens when too many assume they are right, simply because popular opinion is so entrenched.
Harlan Bretz was an American geologist working in the middle of the 20th century, who first proposed that the channeled scablands of eastern Washington state in the United States of America were the result of colossal floods. He did this in the 1920s when uniformitarianism was still dominant in geology, and had been for the past few decades. As a result, his ideas were initially rejected. However, by the 1950s, actualism had largely replaced uniformitarianism. Actualism is the idea in geology that rocks that are known to form gradually did so, but that we can also see catastrophic processes in the present and use them to infer when catastrophic processes in the past occurred to create the rocks and geomorphology that we see today. Essentially, it is the more realistic middle ground between both strict uniformitarianism and strict catastrophism. Modern geology acknowledges that both slow and steady and fast and chaotic processes happen, and it has ways to tell which kind of process formed what. By the 1950s, Brett's work from the 1920s was vindicated. But guess what, creationists? Pointing to a scientist whose work took decades to be recognized doesn't actually make you right. It's true that on its own, rejection by the current scientific world doesn't make you wrong, but you still have to actually, demonstrate why you're right, and unlike Brett's, who used rigorous observation, mathematics, and theoretical work, creationists usually just lie and get basic logic wrong. So let's see if you do better, Brian.
When someone asks how Mount Everest could have been covered by the flood, ask them why they assume Everest and all other mountain ranges for that matter were present at the time.
Holy crap, dude, we've been over this. Every bit of evidence points to them being way older than 5,000 years. If you want to claim they're not, it's not just an assumption that they were. Everything about them, from how the sediment folded, the radiometric dating, to the rate the processes that we can currently see building them go, indicate that dating any of these ranges at the absurdly young age of less than 5,000 years is batshit crazy. It's on you to show why it's not simply to say, well, if they're young, that works for me. Great, if I had $8 million, that would be great for me too. But guess what? That doesn't put money in my bank account. Do the work to show why these mountains aren't as old as everyone knows them to be, otherwise you're going to have to contend with the fact that they are. And if that falsifies Noah's flood, then it's time for a new theology.
Hydroplate theory makes few assumptions, but if you take time to understand it, you'll see it provides excellent answers to these and dozens of other questions.
Does it? Because so far, you, who are trying to explain it in this very video, haven't even begun to start giving us any explanations. And everything has come down to, well, the flood is plausible if I just assume that reality is whatever would be convenient for me. And guess what? You don't get to assume that.
This is a cross-section of Earth's present state.
Yeah, nice and arranged by density at this level of resolution. Neato.
No one has ever dug down to see this, and you'll see why we can't dig to the center of the Earth later. However, we know this layout exists by timing seismic waves from earthquakes as they travel through the Earth. Sound travels at different speeds through solid materials than liquids, and this is the rough picture of what is down there. There is a thin crust which sits on top of an 1,800-mile thick solid mantle. Then there is a very dense molten outer core that surrounds the mostly iron-nickel inner core.
Well, the mantle is kind of solid, but it also flows. It has a viscosity that is extremely high, and if you could hold a chunk of it without burning your hands off, it would essentially be solid. But still, it does flow, just very slowly. That's how plate tectonics works.
The liquid of the outer core is twice the density of the rocky mantle.
Hey, just what you'd expect if the Earth were basically arranged by density.
Zooming in on a cross-section of the surface near the edge of a continent, we would see the following. Continents are made primarily of granitic materials. The granite continents rest on the mantle. The Mohorovicic discontinuity, or MOHO, is a boundary line between the crust and the mantle. Seismic waves travel much faster below the MOHO than above, for reasons that we will soon discover.
I'm impressed. You're getting stuff right, and finally, perhaps laying the groundwork for your ideas, rather than just whining that people make assumptions and that science is a mean poopy head.
Most of the surface of all continents are covered with sedimentary rock that averages about a mile thick. Sedimentary rocks are made up of finely ground bits of crystalline rock, like granite or basalt, that have been cemented together by a cementing agent like calcium carbonate. For example, sandstone and limestone are sedimentary rocks. Metamorphic rocks occur when sedimentary or crystalline rock is greatly compressed and heated. For example, marble and diamond are metamorphic rock. The two most prominent surface rocks are basalt and granite. The floors of the ocean basins are primarily lined with basalts, which are igneous, meaning formed from a melt state.
Yup, and it's also why the oceanic plates sit lower in the mantle. Basalt is more dense than granite.
We know basalts are igneous because we see them being produced in nature and can replicate basalts from a melt in a lab.
I mean, yeah, but also, even if we couldn't, we could tell because they're composed of largely undistorted crystals that are in place and there's no cementing agent like in a sedimentary rock. We don't actually have to watch rock form to have a good idea of the basic type of rock we have. If you've got a rock that's made of various crystals and those crystals don't show signs of warping or significant heating since formation, you've got an igneous rock. If there is warping and subsequent heating, you've got a metamorphic rock. And if you've got, rather than in situ crystals, a bunch of grains held together by a cementing agent, you've got sedimentary rock. This isn't exactly the most complex part of geology.
Continents are primarily granites, which are slightly less dense than basalts. Contrary to what is commonly assumed, granite does not appear to be igneous, meaning formally melted.
Other than because it would be convenient for you, why would that be? It's an entirely crystalline rock, which is, kind of what you get when you have an igneous rock. What about granite isn't well explained by an igneous origin?
Rather than being igneous, granite would be better termed as an enigma.
Sounds pretty igneous to me, since the way that igneous rocks form is that magma or lava cools and crystals form as various solid materials come out of solution and form into regular crystal matrices, each of which then grows until it meets other crystals, at which point there's an interface. That's what we're seeing in granite.
Granite is made of very large crystals of quartz, feldspar, hornblende, and mica.
Yep, but if they're in a solution that starts hotter than the melting point of the one with the highest melting point, and then it cools to lower than the melting point of the one with the lowest melting point, I'm not seeing a problem.
These materials have differing densities and melting points.
Well, good to see that you actually do know how density in a liquid works there, Brian. Unfortunately for you, there are some effects working against you, such as the fact that the silicon magma that forms granite is so viscous that over the time frame it takes to cool granite, the heavier members of the granite, such as mica, don't have time to move significantly. Imagine if you had a vinaigrette. If you leave it in a jar on the table, you'll notice that the vinegar and the oil separate out, with the oil rising to the top, and the heavier vinegar and water solution going to the bottom. But if you shake this up, it'll stay mixed for a few seconds. But let's say that you mix up the vinaigrette thoroughly and then proceed to plunge it into liquid nitrogen. The vinaigrette will solidify in a way that defies the normal density sorting. Now, this is an extremely fast process, but the principle is similar. If the cooling is too rapid for the heavy elements to settle to the bottom, then they won't. And this doesn't actually have to be very fast if the magma in question is very viscous. Also, not all granite is in fact igneous. Some of it is formed by hydrothermal alteration of other minerals, but it is observably distinct, and this cannot be extended to all granites. I'm not sure if you're going to talk about that, but I figured I'd head it off at a pass, in case you decide to.
If granite was molten for millions of years and slowly cooled as assumed, the differing liquid mineral densities would naturally self-sort due to gravity, just like oil and water. The result would be a layered cake pattern, not the large interlocked crystalline patterns that we see today.
If the magma could flow fast enough.
No one has ever reproduced large-grain granites seen in nature.
The inability of humans to make something that is found in nature is not any indication of how it was made. If in the future humans gain the ability to artificially produce granite, will that suddenly mean that granite was what geologists said it was all along? Humans can't make tornadoes either. That doesn't make them the vengeful smitings of an angry god about to collect sinners into his hands. Besides, we all know that tornadoes are actually from the Q continuum.
He's back!
The end product both in the lab and in nature when a granite is melted and resolidified is a plain igneous rock called rhyolite.
Well, of course, rhyolite is what happens when rather than forming intrusively under the ground inside other rocks, the same silica-rich magma that could form granite instead forms on the surface as an extrusive rock. That means it cools much more rapidly, as can be seen with the much smaller crystal size. If you melt granite in a lab and then cool it over the course of like a few hours, of course it won't form granite again. It needs to cool at a rate slow enough for the large crystals to form. But that's going to be longer than you can use the lab for, so no luck. This is like saying that because letting ice cream melt and then sticking it back in the freezer doesn't result in the same ice cream that you took out of the freezer in the first place, that therefore there's no explanation for how ice cream forms in the first place. Nature isn't as simple as anything that freezes, melts, and freezes again will be structurally identical in both instances of the solid phase. Freezing rates matter. You might know that if you ever tried to make clear bubble-free ice. You can't do it too fast or all the bubbles will form all over the place. You have to freeze the water slowly so the bubbles can concentrate at the top. I don't know what to tell you, Brian, but rocks are complicated, and that fact still doesn't mean that you can dismiss the igneous nature of the vast majority of granites.
Which has tiny crystal grains like igneous basalts do.
Ah yes, basalt, another extrusive igneous rock. Now, since granite is an intrusive rock, I'm not sure why this matters. Fun fact, when you melt intrusive igneous rocks and then cool them rapidly here on the surface of the planet, they turn into the extrusive version of that rock. You know what happens when basaltic magma cools more slowly underground? You don't get basalt. You get diabase, which, like granite, has larger crystals. And you know what happens if you melt some diabase and cool it off at the surface of the Earth? You get basalt. Because of course you do.
The borders and edges of continents taper and are beveled. The continents generally thin and taper out under the ocean's surface, forming the continental shelf, which runs out under the water between 300 and 600 feet deep.
I guess we're changing topic, But to wrap that up, no, granite isn't magical.
The true edge of the continent then rapidly drops off in a bevel shape to an ocean depth averaging 12,000 feet, forming the continental slope. Notice that the thinned continental shelf connects the continents. If ocean levels were several hundred feet lower, you could almost walk from Southeast Asia to Australia and from Siberia to Alaska.
No, there are deep areas that would stop you walking from Australia to Asia, which goes a long way to explaining why basically only humans and dogs ever managed to get from Asia to Australia or vice versa until after Europeans started mucking about. Despite, multiple ice ages that did in fact drop water levels such that Asia and North America were connected.
If this were the case after the flood, while much of the flood waters remained trapped on the continents, there was a good reason behind God's direction for survivors of the flood to spread out as they increased in population.
Even your map doesn't show the actual land bridge between Asia and Australia, man. Come on. Don't discredit yourself on screen in your own video. But also, what the heck is trapping the water on the continents? Continents aren't exactly well known for their ability to hold an ocean's worth of liquid water, or, they'd be doing that. And if they did, but then it rushed off, we'd see channeled scablands like we see in Washington all over the place. But we don't. We see that almost nowhere. Ironically, we see it on Mars too, but somehow I don't think Mars was the globe that flooded in the Noah story, unless some really big parts of the story were omitted.
This also may explain why in Genesis 9, Nimrod and those who settled on the plain of Shinar in today's Iraq were quickly confused by God with differing languages and thereby forced to spread out.
I'm sorry, so are you saying that they settled in Shinar because the ocean levels were low? Why would that make them settle in one place? I fail to see the connection here. But also, remember when this was about the flood and not Nimrod? Pepperidge Farms remembers.
This also explains why the origin of all language is tracked back to this region.
Oh well, that's cool, except that the origin of all language is not tracked back to that region, or any region for that matter. Proto-world is a fun hypothesis that would unite all human languages to a single hypothetical ancestor language, which would have to have been spoken somewhere. But guess what? There isn't enough evidence to say that there even was such a thing, never mind where it would have been spoken. As it stands now, language families traced back as far as they can go don't all converge geographically on Mesopotamia. For instance, the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor language of languages like English, Greek, Farsi, and Hindi, lived around the Black Sea. The speakers of Proto-Sino-Tibetan, the ancestor of languages such as Vietnamese, Mandarin, and Tibetan, came from around the Yellow River Basin. In fact, of the world's language families, really only the Afro-Asiatic languages like Egyptian, Arabic, Hebrew, Somali, Tuareg, Hausa, and Berber could reasonably be located in Mesopotamia, which is curious given that this origin of language stories comes from an Afro-Asiatic book, almost like it was being written in a Semitic context with little wider knowledge of the linguistic landscape of the world, and so perhaps shouldn't be taken seriously as a simple, literal, and sober account of human history.
About 2 generations after Babel, the earth was divided in the day of Peleg in Genesis chapter 10.
I've yet to hear anyone really explain for sure what that even means. I wonder if you'll do it.
Peleg's name is a root for many words today concerning water, like archipelago or bath pelagic.
Oh boy, where to even start? So let's take a look at this Greek. It is indeed true that pelagos means sea in ancient Greek, and no one really knows where that word comes from. Greek is an Indo-European language, but this word seems to be a novel invention there. The basic root in Indo-European for sea or ocean is mer, which we can see in the Latin word mare. Peleg in Hebrew is from the triconsonantal root plg, meaning divide, especially by digging a furrow. It has cognates in other Semitic languages, such as Arabic, where the cognate means gap or crack, Tigrinya, where it means narrow pass, gorge, or riverbed, Phoenician, where it means a district, that is a place divided for a purpose in a city. In Akkadian, it means a fencing or a region, and the water connection comes up in another use in Akkadian as well as in Ugaritic, where in Akkadian it means canal, and in Ugaritic it means a stream. But you can see that clearly the basic use here is that the root means to divide, especially by cleaving or digging a furrow. The water-based meanings flow from the fact that such a cleaving may then have water flow through it. How this is supposed to be related to the Greek word for ocean simply because they happen to sound similar is beyond me. The fact that the PLG root has some secondary uses to mean small stream of water, especially one created by humans, is completely insufficient to show an etymological link to the Greek word for ocean or sea. Finally, that last claim that you didn't say out loud, but that's up on your slide, that Peleg means small river in English, seems weird, and I couldn't find an English dictionary listing it. Turns out it's just copied from the Wikipedia page for the biblical character Peleg. It's a single sentence with no citation in the 2-sentence section, popularity of the name. That's it. Great source there, Brian.
This lends credence to the idea that the Earth was literally divided by rising ocean levels that separated the continents in the days of Peleg.
Are you sure it lends credence? Are you sure it doesn't, do nothing? Because the fact that a Greek word sounds kind of like a Hebrew word with a different meaning doesn't really, mean anything of wider significance, besides that sometimes two languages have words that sound similar. The Arabic word ball means mind, and it sounds like the English word ball. So maybe that means that it was really an Arabic genius that invented ball-based sports like football, baseball, and basketball. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. I don't know. Who can say?
I'll now give a brief general summary of how Earth formed from an evolutionary view.
Oh, okay. You're not even going to try to substantiate anything we've heard from the previous 15 minutes of your video. Yeah, that makes sense. Sure, let's hear what I'm sure won't be a strawman version of what science has to say about the formation of the Earth.
There are actually many differing views, but the following appears to be the most popular today. Supposedly 4.5 billion years ago, asteroids gravitationally collapsed into each other, and the energy released from these impacts produced a molten liquid Earth, which remained molten for millions of years.
So far, so good.
As accretion ceased, the surface eventually cooled and formed a solid crust. But as we just covered, a granite crust could not have originated from a previously molten condition.
No, you didn't cover it, you asserted it. Granite absolutely does result from liquid magma, and even if you want to complain that some of the primordial solid surface of the Earth should be rhyolite, not granite, then okay. I don't know who's claiming that the granite core of the continental plates of today has to go back to the first solid surface of the Earth. Such rock is basically all gone anyway, having long since been subducted and ground away by erosion.
And no lab has ever been able to replicate granite from a molten state.
Tell you what, you let me know the next time you find a lab with an opening for a few millennia that we can book. Then we can look into it. Till then, this is nothing more interesting than pointing out that you can't grow a 2,000-year-old redwood in a lab from a seedling.
The evolutionary model then states that over time, the remaining inner molten materials were gravitationally separated to form the dense solid inner and outer cores of the Earth. Note that any thermal analysis accounting for all realistic forms of heat generation and heat transfer predicts that the sphere of Earth should have completely solidified by now if it is actually 4.5 billion years old.
Unless, of course, there is something adding heat to the system. Now, what could that be? What exists under the ground that produces heat? Ratioaltimetry? No, that can't be right. Radioconductivity? Close, but that's not it either. Oh, right, it's radioactivity. There's radioactive stuff in the Earth that keeps it hot. If only this weren't something that we hadn't known for a century. When the trillions of decay events that go on all the time in the mantle occur, where do you think the energy goes? It turns into thermal energy. You can't use simple thermodynamic equations with constant thermal energy assumptions to calculate the time to thermal equilibrium for the whole Earth. It won't work, because new thermal energy is added.
This is one of many observations which strongly indicate the upper limit of Earth's age is much younger than assumed when relying on radiometric ratios.
No, it's one of many observations that young Earth creationists will ignore basic high school science anytime it's convenient. Also, the fact that you're referencing radiometric dating means you know radioactive elements exist and are part of the standard model of Earth's formation. So why are you ignoring them in your heat calculations? Besides, it's convenient for you? Oh, no reason. Got it.
To further investigate the fundamental problems with radiometric dating, please refer to my other video titled Hydroplate Theory, The Origin of Earth's Radioactivity.
Dude, you titled this video Hydroplate Theory Overview Part 1. I'm not going to watch the other parts of your video for background to this video when you labeled it as Part 1. If you don't want to bother addressing it in this video, I'll just assume that you can't, which, to be fair, I'm pretty sure is what would happen if I did watch your other video. Since even when the pros at the RATE team tried to discredit radiometric dating, they couldn't, and concluded that it worked unless they assumed miracles. Since the best young Earth creationism has done with actual funding and years of research is a shrug and pointing to a magic wand, I'm skeptical that some rando on YouTube has managed to figure it out, but doesn't want to tell me in his intro video, and instead wants me to go watch some other video.
Evolutionary theory of the Earth's origin assumes that the Earth remained in a molten state for around 200 million years, Naturally, any water brought by asteroids would rise to the surface and evaporate long before the Earth's crust solidified. A runaway greenhouse would have followed, trapping solar heat in the humid atmosphere and making life on Earth impossible forever.
Wait, why? Says who? Water vapor is a good greenhouse gas, I'll give you that. But what modeling and math do you have to say that Earth would necessarily go into a runaway and irrevocable hothouse phase like Venus? Would it be none math?
According to some evolutionists, millions of years after surface solidification, comets bombarded the Earth, depositing even more water on its surface.
This part has largely fallen out of favor since it turns out that the isotopic ratio of the hydrogen and oxygen in Earth's water is not the same as in comets, meaning that they can't be the source of the majority of Earth's water. Although, surely, anytime one hits Earth, some of that water does end up entering Earth's bodies of water, but still, proportionally, this will be fairly minuscule. It seems that Earth's water is homegrown, and probably was there on those small planetesimals that formed it.
But recent discoveries of high deuterium concentration, or heavy water, on comets, compared to Earth's oceans, have led some scientists to conclude that Earth's water could not have come from comets.
Oh hey, that's what I said. That's refreshing. Let's have more of that. Actual scientific accuracy. It's been thin on the ground so far in this video.
In summary, the evolutionary theories of how water came to be so prevalent on Earth's surface is not supported by what we observe today.
What? You have to actually argue for that beyond pointing out that comets probably aren't it. That's not the current idea. What about the water being part of the accretion disk Earth formed out of is contradicted by what we see today? Is this whole video just going to be badly reported versions of scientific models followed by bald assertions that those models don't work on the basis that you just say so? Dude, give your reasons for something. I'm begging you.
But if we assume the evolutionary theory is somehow true, then basic scientific principles tell us that Earth's water should only be found on the surface.
What? No. It tells us that that's where it should be primarily found in the form of actual bodies. It says nothing about the fact that it could be trapped as individual molecules in rock matrices, dragged down in what on a global scale would be small amounts of subduction zones, or that in areas of the crust it may seep into caves or porous rock.
What is surprising from this evolutionary view is that there are unexpectedly large amounts of water trapped at depths far deeper than surface water could ever seep. Here is why deep water under continents is not expected. Imagine a block of soft modeling clay or Play-Doh. Now stack more blocks of clay on top. Eventually the bottom block will deform sideways due to the weight of the added blocks. Add more blocks and more of the material deforms. Now imagine that you have stacked another column of clay blocks very close to the original column. What will it do? It too will deform and compress against the other material. The dashed line represents the boundary at which the compressive strength of the clay or Play-Doh has been exceeded. Material below this boundary forms a tight seal. Even small microscopic cracks cannot exist below this boundary line. Take notice that gravity is the causal source of this condition.
Got it.
Even if surface water is poured into the gap or crack, it cannot seep below the boundary line. For clay or Play-Doh, this boundary may be only a few feet from the surface. You've likely seen a similar scenario after making stovetop pudding or cheesecake, after it cools in the refrigerator overnight. The semi-solid separates or cracks at the surface as it cools, but the crack is not very deep because the weight of the material slumps and closes the crack at a certain depth. Rock like granite has good compressive strength and can support a crack of up to 5 miles depth, but no deeper.
Okay, I'm waiting for the ball to drop here.
In summary, assuming the evolution scenario, water from asteroids and comets collected on the surface before crust solidification.
No, it would be too hot. Water in bulk would be in the atmosphere, and some of it would enter solution with the lava at the surface because water is good at entering solutions with lots of things.
Since granite's max compressive strength is approximately 23,000 pounds per square inch, no significant continental water would be expected below 5 miles depth.
From seepage of surface water, sure, but what about water that's been dragged under a continent by subduction? Oh, we're just going to ignore that. Got it.
However, it is well known that deep water exists much deeper than this. Germany's KTB dig and Russia's Kola dig are the deepest man-made holes in Earth's crystalline continental granite. The goal of these digs was to reach the Earth's mantle rock, but neither succeeded. Both holes reached depths well below the 5-mile boundary of granite's max compressive strength. Both holes encountered unexpectedly extreme heat as depth increased. Even more surprisingly, they both struck saltwater-filled interconnected fractures in the granite.
Sounds kind of like what I just explained, doesn't it? Indeed, the source for this water is not believed by geologists to be surface water, but water from minerals.
More recently, using conductivity measurements, a mile-thick layer of saltwater-filled sediments has been reported 10 miles under the Tibetan Plateau. In fact, deep saltwater appears to be a common trait under all continents.
Let's take a look at that citation, shall we? It's a 1993 paper by R.D. Hindman et al. Published in Physics of Earth and Planetary Interiors. Let's look at the summary. Here are the first 3 paragraphs from it. Quote, surprisingly uniform low electrical resistivity is a fundamental characteristic of the lower continental crust, most regional measurements giving 10 to 30 ohm meters for Phanerozoic areas and 100 to 300 ohm meters for Precambrian areas. Numerous localized anomalies in deep resistivity are superimposed upon this background low resistivity. Most detailed studies have focused on local lateral variations. A different conduction mechanism could be responsible for at least some of the localized anomalies. We have summarized the observational characteristics of the conductive layer and found a number of important constraints. The 2 most probable mechanism candidates, saline aqueous pore fluids and grain boundary graphite, have been examined with respect to these constraints. The main problems with the saline fluid hypothesis are the required continuing source of fluids, the problem of keeping conductive and thus horizontally interconnected pore fluid in the lower crust, and the expected absorption of any available free water in retrograde metamorphic reactions. Most of the constraints discussed in this paper, however, can be accommodated by the saline fluid model, including the narrow range of lower crustal resistivities, the difference between Precambrian and Phanerozoic areas, and the uniformity of the lower crustal conductivity across major structural boundaries, the apparent temperature control to the top of the conductive layer, and the associations of other geophysical parameters. The graphite film mechanism allows a lower crust with dry granulite mineralogy. Some difficulties are the required pervasive reducing conditions in the lower crust for graphite stability, and the theoretical and observational evidence for restriction of most graphite to isolated grain boundary corners. However, recent sample measurements support the presence of thin graphite films on the rocks from the deep crust. The constraints discussed in this paper appear less well accommodated by the graphite model than the saline fluid model. The narrow range of observed resistivities and the difference between Precambrian and Phanerozoic areas are not easily explained. A restricted range of graphite amount and interconnection is required that changes with age. The correlations of depths of the conductive lower crust with present heat flow and temperature seem to require an association with the brittle ductile transition. A model for the breaking of graphite interconnection with uplift and cooling has been developed. Reconnection with increasing heat flow may also be required. The suggested correlations of conductive deep crust and seismic reflectivity, velocity, and attenuation are not readily explained by this mechanism." End quote. So here we have not an observation of vast saltwater reservoirs, but the possibility that within the pores and cracks of rock deep underground, there may be thin films of salty water, or there may not, and instead it might be graphite. This isn't exactly a slam dunk for hydroplate theory.
Hydroplate theory asks the question, if evolution theory does not predict deep water, then how else did the water get so deep under all the continents?
Evolutionary theory is about the diversity of living things. It makes no predictions about deep water. But other than there should be water, I'm not really hearing much in the way of actual hydroplate predictions either.
At this point, it is interesting to note that the Bible indicates in several places that water was and is under the earth.
How could people in the Iron Age have known that springs existed? I mean, I personally have found springs, but I live in like the 21st century, where I can do things like swim in spring-fed ponds or hike. But people in the Bronze Age couldn't just swim or walk. They didn't have the technology.
Psalms repeatedly indicates this. The deep is in storehouses. The earth is founded upon the seas and upon the waters. The earth is spread out above the waters. Finally, and most telling, is the opening action of the flood recorded in Genesis 7 verse 11. The Bible strongly indicates large amounts of water were originally deep under the earth.
Yes, in the cosmic ocean, which also existed above the earth, because the ancient Hebrews thought the earth was inside a dome. In fact, early rabbis thought that the sun went through some kind of door at night then went above the earth, but on the other side of the dome, and then back to the east, although Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, a 2nd century rabbi, said that this was probably wrong. The fountains of the great deep in Genesis directly parallel the floodgates of heaven, which are ways for the water above the earth to pour in as the waters from below the earth well up, both from the cosmic ocean. This is why Isaiah 40:20-22 says,
It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain, and spreads them like a tent to dwell in.
The circle is the circumference of the flat earth, and the heavens are like a tent in that it is a thing that covers over the inside, which has a flat bottom, such that when you look up from the bottom, you see the tent above you. And no, it does not mean sphere. Check a Hebrew lexicon. The verb with the same root means to describe or draw a circle. The noun is just the thing drawn when you do the action of the verb. Unsurprisingly, the works like Isaiah, the Psalms, and Genesis, being Iron Age works, have an Iron Age cosmology as their background assumption. Now, I don't think the Bible is trying to teach a flat earth cosmology, but it certainly, in the older texts, at least assumes one.
The hydroplate theory uses these biblical descriptions in combination with many real-world observations we've just covered to derive its starting assumption about the original layout of Earth.
No, it doesn't. It uses Walt Brown's imaginative reinterpretation of these verses as compatible with a globe-shaped Earth, which is ironic, since the only reason to bother being a young Earth creationist in the first place is a literalist reading of Genesis, and to a lesser extent, certain parts of the Psalms, Gospels, and Prophets, etc. Really, the ironic thing is that flat earthers have a more consistent hermeneutic than do young Earth creationists who aren't flat earthers. Taking the Bible at face value, there's really no option other than being a flat earther if you want to take it as your authoritative source of truth, and you also want a woodenly literal reading of Genesis.
Which is radically different than what we see today, and certainly much different than what uniformitarian theory proposes.
I feel like I've said this many times before, but uniformitarianism is not the current operating idea in geology in the present day. Instead, it has been replaced by actualism. Actualism acknowledges the existence of catastrophic events as important to the formation of many rocks. It also notes, however, that the formation of many other kinds of rocks, like evaporites, limestone, non-flocculated shale, etc., cannot be rapid because this is physically impossible given what we know of physics and geology.
The assumed condition is that the Earth's surface crust was formed above a deep layer of water.
Yeah, that's a problem on its own. What with that whole density tower thing that the Earth forms at this level of granularity. You can't get the crust just stably sitting on a subterranean ocean. That crust would more or less immediately collapse onto the water, which will come up, and there you go.
This is a global condition wherein the Earth crust was an unbroken spherical supercontinent which covered and sealed in a deep layer of water trapped between it and the mantle rock.
Oh, and this is evidenced by worldwide pre-flood terrestrial depositional environments that can be found around the globe, right? Oh, it's not? Sounds like an ad hoc idea with literally nothing to back it up. But you know who's not stuck in pre-flood deposits? My subscribers. So if you want to avoid being fossilized deep in the geological column, why not subscribe?
Many imagine that a combination of forces like the tidal pull of the moon, Coriolis forces, and centrifugal forces would somehow rip this shell apart immediately, and therefore hydroplate theory is invalid from its first assumption.
By many, of course, you mean basically all actual scientists and every young Earth pseudoscientist who isn't directly associated with the Center for Scientific Creation, which is basically all the young Earth professionals who aren't Walt Brown. I can't drive home how fringe this idea is enough. Young Earth creationism is already basically only differentiated from flat Earth by funding. And even in that far fringe of pseudoscience, hydroplate is so far on the fringe of that, it's like you gave your cowboy jacket's fringe its own fringe and then gave that some fringe. We're 3 recursions of fringe deep, people.
However, few can maintain such a view once they compare all these forces to the dominating gravitational force of Earth.
Fun fact, the force of gravity from Earth would basically not apply. You see, Isaac Newton himself already did the math on what force of gravity would be exerted by a hollow sphere of even density and thickness on objects inside the sphere. The answer is none. The forces from all sides exactly cancel out. Now, of course, the crust wouldn't have been a perfect sphere of uniform density, but at large scales, this would mostly even out, meaning that the net gravitational forces between the crust and the mantle would have been mostly nil. This means that other forces like tidal forces and Coriolis would indeed dominate in this regime. Those forces would all tend to reverse the situation. The model is not stable, and it's not stable on the order of hours or days, not the centuries needed.
Although other forces are present, they can often be ignored because they are so small compared to gravity.
Unless gravity is reduced to almost zero, as in this case. Plus, even if it were not, it would be a more or less constant force around the whole globe. So even then, the forces that are dynamic, like tidal forces, would in fact still dominate. That's why even today, despite the fact that the force of gravity from the Earth is orders of magnitude stronger than tidal forces from both the Sun and Moon, both of those have an obvious effect on water levels. That's why tides exist, and importantly, why neap tides exist. That is, tides when the Sun and Moon are more or less in a line and the tides are more extreme. You don't get to ignore this force just because gravity is, in your estimation, much stronger. If that were the case, then all motion would have to overcome the magnitude of gravity. But that's not how force summation works. Summing forces is a vector math problem. If you have forces acting orthogonal to gravity, then it will cause effects regardless of that gravity. That is why you can push a very heavy ball with less force than the force holding the ball to the Earth. This is like basic physics taught to preteens in the United States. That's the level of education needed to know this is nonsense. The average 12-year-old can find the problems with hydroplate theory.
There is a reason gravity is the first force we learn of in school.
There's no uniform physics curriculum in the USA, never mind a worldwide one. I'm not sure gravity is the first force one learns about, although it's probably the first of the fundamental forces that one can name in most cases. But generally, I learned about various forces in the form of transfer of kinetic energy and Newton's laws of motion before I learned about the law of gravity in a formal sense, beyond it being the reason things fall. But sure, gravity is pretty basic and it's pervasive, so it's not like it's unimportant.
As we discuss the hydroplate theory's many observations, take note of how so much of the theory's explanation is simply founded upon the physics of what happens to materials under the influence of Earth's gravity.
Even if those so-called observations are accurate, they'd happen immediately. Like, we're talking before Adam and Eve eat the fruit immediately.
Rather than speculation about unconfirmed natural processes or imagined miracles.
Literally, the entire basis of hydroplate requires an imagined miracle, simply because there's no natural way for Earth to form with a layer of water under the granitic crust of the Earth. The only way for it to be that way is a direct miracle, unless you've got some new physics for us, Brian. I'm glad that you wrongly think that after that initial miracle, that no further miracles are needed, but you can't present this model as if it doesn't require an imagined miracle for no reason. The whole thing is based fundamentally on a miracle, and therefore, even if it's true, it's outside the realm of science. But oh well, let's keep going.
We'll see hydroplate theory turn again and again to Earth's gravity as the causal mechanism which drove processes and produced various effects.
That I'll agree with, from what I know of hydroplate theory. It really depends on that potential energy from the granitic crust.
The Bible records further detail of these assumed starting conditions in the creation account of Genesis 1. The Hebrew for waters here is mayim, which is always used to describe liquid water. Many attempt to explain waters in verse 2 as if it is a frozen or gaseous vapor in space, but Hebrew does not use mayim to describe those states of water.
I actually agree here too. The waters described in Genesis and elsewhere are not a vapor or an ice canopy. It's a cosmic ocean above and below. But I notice, Brian, that you're ignoring the waters above the earth from Genesis 1:7. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. Because Genesis describes a flat earth surrounded by a cosmic ocean kept out by the firmament. Why are you not mentioning the waters there, Brian? Is it because even you know that taking the Bible so literally is silly? But if that's the case, you could just take more of it in a non-literal way and just accept science generally. But hey, I'm not your priest.
Hebrew has many other words to describe ice, clouds, and vapor states, so clearly liquid water is in view.
Okay, you've convinced me. Move on.
Then on the second day of creation, God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." The word rakia comes from the root word raka, meaning to spread, beat, or hammer out, as with a metal. It can also mean a plate.
Yes, like beaten metal. You know, a solid object.
The Septuagint translates rakia with stereoma, meaning a solid, firm structure. The Latin Vulgate uses the term firmamentum, from which the King James translators coined the term firmament. The implication is that the expanse was a solid, firm material.
Wait, Brian, we are in agreement on this? So you're actually saying that there was a solid dome over the Earth? Maybe you've been an intellectually consistent flat Earth creationist this whole time. I mean, if that's the case, then I guess props on taking the brave option of taking literalism seriously.
Again, mayim is used in verse 6, so day 2 seems to describe a state where liquid waters from Genesis 1 verse 2 were divided in half and separated by a solid plate of material.
Right, but it's in the sky, because birds fly across it in Genesis 1:20. So it's not the crust of the earth, it's the sky. I'm now becoming concerned that you're actually reading a whole lot into the text that just is not there. That's what we call eisegesis in the biz of Bible interpretation. It's generally frowned upon.
Remember I said granite is an enigma and has never been replicated.
Yes, I remember when you asserted that, gave no citations, and then ignored the granitic magma is highly viscous. It was dumb then, and I'm guessing that whatever you're going to base on that idea will be dumb by inheritance of that dumbness.
Hydroplate theory proposes that this expanse material was a miraculous formation of a granite crust separating surface water from the waters of the deep.
A granite crust with birds flying in it. Yeah, that checks out. That's not incredibly stupid and flatly contradicted by basically every ounce of the text and every bit of our knowledge of ancient cosmology, Brian. If anything, this is somehow even stupider than Flat Earth. At least Flat Earth doesn't contradict the text it's based on. So this idea is not only physically impossible, it contradicts the very hermeneutical method that young Earth creationists claim to use. No wonder even the other young Earth creationists hate it.
On the third day, Genesis 1 describes the results of God's further direction to firmly position the somewhat unstable expanse and bring it to a more stable equilibrium. Hydroplate theory proposes that the granite expanse was deformed at many points around the Earth, which settled into the solid mantle foundation below. Naturally, the thicker and denser portions of the crust would sink to the solid mantle foundation, but because the volume of water trapped below the crust was fixed, the lighter and less dense portions of the crust had to rise out of the water. This is exactly what Genesis 1 verse 9 describes when God says, "Let the dry land appear."
And we have evidence of this folding, right? Because that would stretch the crystals in the granite. If this happened, it shouldn't be hard to find, and yet I see no citation of actual granite with such stretching. What you've described isn't what pillars are. You've described sagging in the crust, which happened apparently because God said so, and not because of any particular natural process. Pillars are identifiable, separate, and small structures which hold up some kind of larger ceiling. Maybe I'm just being nitpicky, but the impression I and others get is vertical columns of rock that hold the Earth above the cosmic ocean, not just a bump in the crust of the Earth.
The deformations raised the topography at the surface for dry land, and the depressions gathered surface waters, producing small seas. Again, Psalm seems to add further description that matches with this concept. Psalm 75:3, "It is I who have firmly set its pillars." Remember Psalm 33:7 said that God laid up the deep in storehouses.
Making Earth basically a grenade with the pin pulled. Good to know that no matter whether humans sinned or not, God had set the Earth up to just basically explode inevitably. I wonder how that corresponds to him having already made a perfect world. My definition of a perfect world doesn't really include it being a time bomb with a fuse that's probably like at best a few weeks. But even if it's only a few centuries, that still seems like a problem.
It is important to note that the pillars themselves did not support the entire weight of the crust. Most of the weight was supported by the pressurized water of the deep.
A topography for which we have no evidence, and also far from looking like a garden paradise, with so much less surface water, Earth would look more like Arrakis than it would like Kashyyyk. Rainfall comes from evaporation of surface water, and with less of that comes less evaporation, which means less moisture in the atmosphere. And more land means it's spread out over an even larger surface area in terms of land biome formation. That means that the world would basically be a global desert spotted with oases, where the oceans are. Further, with only low mountains, there would be little to break the winds formed as a result of convection cells, meaning that most of Earth would be constantly buffeted by sandstorms. Earth in this scenario, far from seeming very good, seems like a hellscape.
The stench of death.
With much of the water trapped under the crust, Earth would have had much more available landmass with many small shallow seas dotting the surface. Mountains would have been smaller than today.
Okay, but that's worse. I mean, you do get how that's worse, right?
Hydroplate theory figures that approximately half of the water in today's oceans started out under the granite shelf, forming one giant supercontinent all around the globe.
Peanut butter theory posits that originally half of the world's peanut butter was trapped inside a giant asteroid, and we've been mining it for peanut butter ever since. Yay, I can make up unevidenced, physically impossible bullshit too.
This estimate of the volume of water under the crust is based on the concentration of salt in the oceans today compared to what was found in the Bavarian KTP dig hole.
Thereby assuming that ocean water and the deep crust water have the same source. But do we actually have any reasons to believe this? No, of course not.
In addition, water found in comets contains around twice the deuterium concentration that is in the oceans.
Demonstrating pretty conclusively that the oceans and the comets have different sources for their water, this is a problem for Hydroplate, not a feature.
The estimate also assumes that pre-flood seas were fresh water, which after the flood mixed about equal parts with this super salty deuterium-rich subterranean water, diluting it to the levels measured in the oceans today.
Remind me, what prevented the salts from accumulating pre-flood? Is it miracles? Because you said you weren't using those, and some salts in today's oceans would take far less than the supposed time between the fall and the flood to accumulate. Sure, the oceans at the time of the flood might not have been as salty as they are today, but they would have been at least brackish and certainly not good for drinking before then.
I will describe more about the most likely origin of comets later, so hold on to this info, as I'm sure at this point it seems strange that water and comets would have anything to do with the flood or with the Earth.
Oh, we know already. It's that you think that all the comets were formed from Earth water, and that this stuff also caused essentially all the craters in the solar system, which is why this theory is often amusingly and pejoratively called the lunar bukkake theory. Kids, if you don't know what that is, wait till you're like 18. By then you'll have probably figured it out.
Hydroplate does not place an upper bound on the original volume of water in the chamber because there are some unknowns that have a large effect on the final answer. Today we know there are large amounts of water trapped deep in the porous Mohorovicic boundary layers, but we don't know by volume how much is down there.
Nor do your citations even claim that we found this water. Just that such water existing in and between the pores in the deep crust might explain the relatively low resistivity of the deep crust.
We also don't know how much water escaped Earth's atmosphere during the flood.
You better hope not much, because water going from below the surface to escape velocity is going to cause a heat problem like you wouldn't believe. We're talking multiple hydrogen bombs per square kilometer of the Earth levels of heat.
The ball of fire is 3 miles across as it shatters both land and sea. The shock wave races 35 miles and reaches the control ship with force enough to jar the solidly mounted camera. In seconds, the fireball erupts into a geyser that towers 25 miles into the stratosphere, spreading into a 100-mile wide mushroom cloud. Rising with the cloud are millions of cubic feet of radioactive ash, a virulent byproduct of the fusion bomb that will shower down over the area in approximately 1 hour.
Noah's going to need a spaceship and a warp drive to survive this. A wooden boat isn't going to cut it.
Both of these unknown variables would add to the volume estimate based on the above concentrations of deuterium and salt.
Yeah, but the more you explain as lost volume, the worse the heat problem gets. And you, like all creationists, have yet to even propose a mechanism that could shed all this heat, beyond miracle.
So for now, we'll just say the deep, or the Great Deep as referred to in Genesis 7:11, was a global interconnected subcrustal ocean chamber that was at least 0.9 miles deep at the time of the flood.
Cool, so we're ignoring what the Bible actually says so that we can be biblical literalists. That makes sense. Honestly, before this video, I didn't realize how unbiblical this is. Never mind how physically absurd it is. I'm impressed that Walt Brown has managed to basically just crap all over not just physics, but Genesis too. No wonder virtually everyone says this so-called theory is bunk.
Based on observations of current size and thickness of continents, hydroplate theory proposes that the original granite plate was 60 miles thick. If you've read prior editions of the theory, you'll notice that this is increased from initial estimates of 10 miles thickness,
putting the subterranean ocean under much more pressure, making it much less stable. Neato! See, the thing with this and other creationist models is that every time they solve one problem, like adding enough volume to the crust in the subterranean ocean to account for the interplanetary debris Walt says were caused by a flood, it creates another problem. The reason for this, fundamentally, is that young Earth creationism is wrong, and so there is no way for it to be both internally coherent and for it to also match observations in the real world. That's why young Earth creationists always have incoherent models. You see it here, you see it with the thickness of the crust, you see it in creationists simultaneously holding to the waiting time problem and also created heterozygosity. It's the same as when flat earthers use mutually exclusive explanations to explain things like time zones, the self-celestial pole, and sunrise and sunset. Turns out, when you've decided from the outset that a particular conclusion must be true, even though it isn't, it's hard to then develop a coherent and internally consistent idea of how the world operates and the history thereof.
This change was arrived at after carefully considering the implications of several rather recent discoveries. Most recently in New Zealand, researchers have used explosives to generate specific short wavelength seismic waves to produce the clearest picture of what they believe to be a subducting plate.
Are you saying it's not a subducting plate?
They are puzzled, however, because almost 50 miles down, a 6-mile thick channel containing melted rock and/or water has also been identified. This is not at all what popular plate tectonic theory predicts.
Still waiting on that citation for it's somehow inexplicable by plate tectonics. Why do I feel like we're not going to get a citation?
For hydroplate theory, these discoveries are exciting because they are consistent with how a collapsed water-permeated subterranean chamber would be expected to reflect these seismic waves.
I notice that you also have no citation for that. Interesting.
The much slower wave velocities measured in the channel indicate magma and/or water trapped within the chamber's roof and floor.
Well, given that crust material usually has a significantly lower melting point than the rocks of the mantle, and therefore it tends to melt into magma pools, which can cause volcanoes, which is how the whole ring of fire around the Pacific formed and is forming, this doesn't actually sound all that out of line with plate tectonics. In fact, it sounds outright predicted.
We will soon cover in detail how hydroplate theory explains these findings using cause-to-effect reasoning.
You say that, but the video only has like 5 more minutes, so I'm not sure how much explanation we're going to get. And based on how this intro did, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of point of me delving into the other half dozen or so episodes you have, Brian.
This is the first strong evidence that the granite crust was in fact much thicker than previous estimates.
Is it strong evidence? Are you sure it's not, no evidence at all? That's what it sounds like.
Corroborating this is the growing body of evidence that trans-Neptunian objects, or TNOs, are most likely from Earth as well.
Excuse me, the f*** did you just say?
Now that sure needs a citation. Seriously, what evidence would that be? Do you even know how much energy it would take to lift 1 kilogram from Earth to the orbit of Neptune? Just to get a kilogram to low Earth orbit takes 32.9 megajoules. That's enough energy to bring a kilogram of ice to boil and then boil it away 12 more times. You want to get this past Neptune, which is 29 times the distance from the Earth to the Sun. That energy has to exist on Earth to get that water to past Neptune. That means it presumably exists in the potential energy of the crust which collapses. That means that energy ends up in large part simply heating the Earth. Can you see now why all estimates have hydroplate boiling off Earth's oceans and then proceeding to at best melt the Earth's crust, if not turn it into a plasma?
Remember, no cracks can exist in granite below 5 miles.
No.
So the perfect seal conditions we just reviewed existed to keep the surface waters from seeping down and, more importantly, the subsurface waters of the deep from pushing up through the granite.
If only the buoyant force didn't exist pushing water up, which then relieves the compressive force on the bottom of the rocks, allowing fractures to propagate upward. Darn.
These are the basic starting assumptions of the hydroplate theory.
Anytime the starting assumptions are absolutely bonkers insane, you know you're in for a good time.
From here, the theory uses only laws of physics to explain cause to effect, which we'll see provides reasonable and straightforward explanation of Earth's surface features today.
Funny, because Earth's surface isn't just a solid sphere of glass, as if the Covenant from Halo got there. Because that's what it should be if you were right, that is, assuming it had time to cool down from being a big ball of plasma.
This is a phase diagram for water. At atmospheric conditions, we see water freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 14.7 pounds per square inch pressure. As heat is added, ice melts and the temperature rises until at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, boiling produces vapor.
Pro tip, if you want to be taken seriously in science, use metric units. Degrees Celsius for temperature and pascals for pressure are what you want. Also, label your damn axes.
The weight of 60 miles of granite above means that the Great Deep was pressurized to approximately 372,000 pounds per square inch.
So we're in the supercritical fluid region. That's not a good thing. That stuff is even more corrosive than just liquid water or steam. It's better at dissolving things than normal water, and its high energy and relatively high viscosity make it great at mechanical erosion too. This is even less sustainable than I thought it was at the beginning. Why does even Walt Brown take this seriously?
As will be seen, work was being done on the water of the Great Deep, which gradually increased its internal energy, so we will refer back to this diagram several times and see how conditions in the water changed and the dramatic effects that were produced.
Dramatic is putting it mildly, Brian.
Just as the moon's gravity works to produce the ocean tides, the original granite shell would also have been worked and distorted by the moon's gravity,
further propagating cracks from both above and below. And remember, since the gravitational force is essentially constant, forces like tidal forces actually become the dominant force in terms of change to the system.
However, because it was a solid shell of great mass, the tidal effect on the crust was not as dramatic as with the open sea.
Maybe not in terms of measurable rise and fall, but that doesn't really help the model at all.
Still, the crust would have deformed into a slight egg shape toward the moon. Obviously, the graphic has been exaggerated so we can see the distortions, and I've simplified the pillars to only 4 dark brown shapes, where the granite was pressed into the solid mantle.
Oh hey, they actually look like pillars this time. Interesting.
In reality, the global surface area of the relatively thin 60-mile crust would have allowed it to form pillars at thousands of locations.
Still no citation, so maybe, but I can just as easily say, no it can't.
Twice a day the shell would have deformed, so the trapped waters of the deep were continually being pumped through the subterranean chamber at high pressure.
That's going to erode those pillars right fast, as well as erode right up through the crust. Because remember, we're in the supercritical zone of the phase diagram. Not the most stable place to be.
This work added energy in the form of heat to the waters under the crust.
Oh good, even more heat. It's almost like the catastrophic collapse of this whole system is inevitable. And as if that is a bit weird for a perfect Earth, and you can't just say maybe this was only set up after the fall, because the verses badly misused by Brian and Walt Brown alike to justify this idea in the first place are all from the prelapsarian creation week period, so that's a no-go.
At the same time, each pillar experienced tension, compression, and shear loads twice a day. Friction from these cyclic loads slowly heated the pillars as well. To get an idea of how these forces produced heat, bend a steel wire or a paperclip back and forth several times, then touch it at the bend. Now imagine how much heat would be generated at the extreme pressures in rock 60 miles deep. As tidal pumping continued, the pressure and temperature in the subterranean chamber increased. Eventually, liquid water changed phase into a state known as supercritical water.
Not sure that's a feature rather than a bug.
The hydroplate theory is not the first to recognize the possibility of a supercontinent.
I like the little question mark as if the existence of Pangaea were at all in question.
We all learned about Edward Bullard's Pangaea concept in high school. Few of us were encouraged to look at it critically, however.
Yeah, it's high school. College students sure do look at it critically, however, and it's very well evidenced by things like paleobiogeography, as well as strata that can be easily correlated horizontally across the continents in a way that really only makes sense if they were physically joined in the past.
For example, what happened to half of Mexico and Central America?
The land bridge between North and South America is extremely recent information. It didn't exist yet. But also, this map is crappy. Here's a better one, and you'll notice that most of Mexico is right there.
And what forces rotated North America clockwise, while South America was rotated counterclockwise?
Tectonic forces, that is, the movement of the mantle. You know, it's kind of in the name, plate tectonics. I'm sorry that the idea that the mantle doesn't always move in straight lines is somehow a concept beyond you, but that doesn't make it not real.
We also probably did not catch the fact that Africa's area is actually 35% larger than we were shown in the books.
That's because it's literally not. That's just a flat-out lie. It's a conclusion you can only come to if you're using a flat map like a Mercator map. Use a globe and suddenly you'll see that it's just not real.
That's right, Africa had to be scaled down by about 35% to make it fit the picture.
No, that's wrong. You're either lying or repeating a lie you were told uncritically.
In fact, Africa and Europe fit poorly with the Americas when positioned in 3D on a globe.
Sorry your little papier-mâché globe doesn't work well, but that's a you problem, not a plate tectonics problem.
Especially when you include the continental shelves that extend under the oceans and do not allow removal of materials as needed in order to force a fit.
Oh, you mean those younger parts of the continental plate? Who cares?
There is another feature on the globe that fits these coastlines much better.
The Mid-Atlantic Ridge, really? The thing that's really only explained by the breakup of Pangaea? Okay.
One of the key observations Walt Brown has made is that with an actual 3D globe, the coastlines of all four continents fit very well with the mid-oceanic ridge.
Yeah, that's kind of the point. What the hell is going on here?
Discovered in the 1950s, the ridge, which wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball, is the longest mountain chain at 46,000 miles length.
And it was a key part of confirming both plate tectonics and the existence of Pangaea.
The fact that this is almost entirely covered by water is not the only trait that sets it apart from today's continental surface mountains.
It's also entirely volcanic and the center point for the seafloor spreading, which is increasing the size of the Atlantic Ocean, pushing new and old worlds farther from each other, and which, if you play it backwards, results in Pangaea at a point in the past.
As we'll soon see, the mid-oceanic ridge is a scar in Earth's mantle left over from the flood, which roughly traces the path of the crack that opened up in the granite shell.
Oh, okay, why is it spreading out then? What caused that?
Surface mountains appear to be the result of compressed materials that have been piled up. This makes sense. Push compressed material together and it piles up.
Meet Mount Omuro, a cinder cone volcano in Japan. What was compressed to make that? Oh, right, it's nothing. It's essentially a blister being pushed up by subterranean magma. It's almost like mountain formation is more complex than this nonsense explanation would lead you to believe.
But the mountains of the mid-oceanic ridge are uniquely different than surface mountains. Tensile fractures show that the material has been pulled apart in two perpendicular directions.
Am I taking crazy pills here? I feel like I'm taking crazy pills.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
That's exactly what plate tectonics expects based on the idea of Pangaea. This is like looking at a suspect's fingerprint on the murder weapon and then concluding that that proves they couldn't be the killer.
This is counterintuitive. How do you build a mountain chain by pulling material apart, in two directions no less?
With volcanoes!
Hydroplate theory explains the unique conditions that produced this strange global geologic feature.
Right, by being physically impossible, causing the melting of the entire crust of the Earth and killing all life. But hey, I guess it could maybe leave you with a ridge somewhere, so that's good.
We will discuss how this happened later, but first let's continue to investigate the nature of supercritical fluids, since it is key to understanding and grasping the magnitude and direction of energy released during the flood.
Sounds cool, except that it's literally the end of the video. Wow, this was far worse than I was expecting, and honestly, just writing the script was quite the chore. Brian, I don't know if I want to even continue with your 7-part series, but perhaps my audience can tell me. If you think you want more hydroplate theory from Brian, let me know, because there's hours more. If you think this is dumb enough already and you don't need more, then let me know that too. Either way, leave it in the comments, and of course make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you've subscribed, turn on notifications with the bell icon so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Bent Hovend, Tapioca Weasel, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, San, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Veed, Eleron Teller, and Pat L. Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.